children of the world are going back to schools again for this beginning of the year, while in Gaza, which is the most dangerous place in this world ever, according to the UNICEF report, we are not going back to schools. I feel very, very sorry for their future because there is no education. There is no normal, regular education for them till now.
Asma Mustafa has not been spared from the horrors of the war. She's a highly accomplished English teacher in Gaza.
I'm the Global Teacher Award winner 2020, the best teacher in Palestine 2022. I was displaced from the north of Gaza to the south 8 times.
The first time she was displaced, Asma was forced to seek refuge at an UNRWA shelter. She was then displaced to the south of the Strip in a tent in Rafah, then another tent in Khan Yunis, and another tent in Deir al-Balah, and eventually to Nusayrat camp, also in a tent in central Gaza.
The children of Gaza have lost the right to education since the 7th of October 2023 till now, as the schools closed the gates. There is no education anymore in Gaza since then. My students always tell me that they miss their schools, their friends, their teachers. I do too. That's why I launched my initiative in the 4th of November last year, which is Pure Educational Initiative. I called it A Story Every Day.
Apart from the lives, the homes, the hospitals, and infrastructure wiped out in 11 months of war, education has also become a distant memory for thousands of students. And the classrooms they once learned and played in have become a place of fear, where they found shelter from bombardment, and sometimes didn't. About 186 schools have been severely damaged or completely destroyed in Gaza. More than 92% have sustained some damage, with a third of UN-run schools having been directly hit. Children have been without an education for a whole year, and they're now about to miss a second year. More than 10,000 students and at least 400 teachers have been killed since October last year. Higher education has not been spared either, with all of Gaza's universities either destroyed or damaged, depriving over 88,000 men and women of pursuing their degrees, some just a semester away from graduation. And it's not just about the sheer scale of the damage, which can theoretically be rebuilt. Many of Gaza's intellectuals and academics have been killed, and notable educational landmarks have been completely erased. Human rights groups are calling this scholasticide, or educide, the complete wipeout of education. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, we look at the impact of Gaza's decimated education sector and how this could have consequences for generations to come.
I decided to be the school for my displacement children around me when their schools were off. I decided to be their books when their books were burned. I decided to be their pens when their pens were broken. I decided to be, the educational process as long as I am alive.
In the absence of formal schooling, Asma is using her initiative to bring displaced kids some form of learning and some semblance of normalcy, despite the unprecedented conditions they're surviving in.
I gather my students around me every day in the displacement place I am in order to tell them a story. The story is full of morals, teaching them life, teaching them lessons in life, principles, how to deal with hard situations. I also teach them, by critical thinking. I want them to think in solving their problems. I mainly want my students to jump, to dance, to sing, to perform dabka, to hold on their pens, to write, to read, to draw, to paint, to color the paintings in the papers. I want them to speak about what happened to them. I want them also to tell stories to each other. I want to make a collaborative, friendly community full of love and positive emotions, among the children. Because this way, I think I teach them life, and I want them to do the same when they go back to their tents with their families. I want them to be leaders in their communities. I want them to be full of positive emotion. I want to take them away from the war, the sounds of rockets, bombs everywhere. I want them to forget a little bit, for a while, the war, to come back to the normal life as if we are pretending to have a normal life. It's a kind of a trying still.
But even a tented school needs supplies, the basics, a chalkboard, some chalk, pencils and papers. Getting everything has become a massive challenge. And even when they are found, they're multiple times the price they once were before the war, much like everything else in Gaza, since Israeli authorities imposed an extremely restrictive blockade since October 7 that has stopped aid and goods and even medicine from coming in. And it's not just material obstacles. There's also the unprecedented trauma that children continue to endure and the psychological damage that educators and experts have to undo.
I think the children of Gaza need time to recover psychologically, and they need time even to breathe again, to hold on their pens again. They need time to be able to write again. And I think the official responsible specialists of education in Gaza and outside Gaza, not only Gaza Strip, would have much to do. They need to work harder and harder to rebuild the psychology of children of Gaza again.
It's not just the children that are scared and losing sleep every night. Parents are terrified too about their children's futures. As Matt says, they're aware that this war, even when it's over, will have lifelong consequences.
Once I remember a mother cried much when I visited her looking for the children in the tent. You know, she was crying because she simply said, "Where are you, teachers? Where is the education? I'm so scared to lose my son. He now works with his father. He's just 9 years old. Can you imagine? He may never go back to schools again." I felt pity towards her and towards like hundreds and thousands of mothers like her.
Asma has dedicated herself to her cause in doing everything she can given the circumstances. Other initiatives like hers have sprung up across the Strip too, to address the need for children to feel slightly normal again. But she makes clear that this is not a substitute for formal education.
We are just providing them with what is called like first aid education. It's exactly just like what is happening in medicine. We make first aid till we come back to schools again. That will help teachers to continue with those little kids an easier way. But it's not going to be an easy mission during the trauma or after the trauma.
We're talking about 625,000 children who have been out of school in Gaza this year. How do we wrap our minds around that number? And what does it mean for an entire population of kids, an entire generation to miss out on a whole year of school, and now, possibly, a second one? I asked this question to Randa Ghazi, Regional Media Manager for the MENA region at Save the Children.
Education, just like every other aspect of life in Gaza, is under attack. All schools have been closed for over 10 months. Nearly 90% of all school buildings and all 12 universities have been damaged or destroyed. These are unprecedented numbers. And since October, education facilities have been used as shelter by people whose homes have been destroyed or those who have been forced to move to avoid hostilities, but this has not prevented Israeli forces from targeting schools. So that's another very concerning aspect. 8 schools were hit by Israeli airstrikes in just 10 days in early July, for example. And last month was also deadly, with 5 UN schools hit in 10 days, including in Israeli military designated safe zones. And it is clear that, as others have said, schools in Gaza are not just schools anymore. They've become shelters and often graveyards. But from my perspective, the most horrifying thing is that the destruction of the Palestinian education system is systemic. There's a clear pattern. There's a name for it. It's scholasticide. It's not just the destruction of the educational infrastructure, but also the obliteration of education through the arrest, for example, detention or killing of teachers, students, and staff. And we need to think that Palestinian schools have historically served as vital hubs for cultural conservation and communal life through learning. So they've really played a crucial role in preserving Palestinian identity, especially in the face of displacement and occupation. So this systematic targeting of schools is an attack on the very fabric of Palestinian society. The destruction also extends to heritage sites, including libraries. The Central Archives of Gaza, for example, containing 150 years of history, has also been hit. And I'd just like also to add that this is not just impacting children in Gaza. It's important to remember that children in the West Bank as well, including East Jerusalem, have faced increasing violence and restrictions since October the 7th. This has created new obstacles for all students in the West Bank. We're talking about over 700,000 students. And we need to remember that Palestinian students in the West Bank have faced significant challenges in accessing quality education for decades. It's not just since, October the 7th. And when we're talking about challenges, we are including in that violence targeting teachers, students, Israeli military operations, raids like the ones we're witnessing now, settler violence. In a way, the events following October the 7th have exacerbated an already existing education crisis to unprecedented levels.
When the Ministry of Education announced recently in the West Bank that schools are going to open for children in Gaza, we spoke to a lot of families there who told us that their own children aren't even ready to go back to school due to the severe trauma by bombardment. What is the impact of war on the actual learning abilities for younger kids, being out of school for such a long time and also being subjected to the amount of violence that they've witnessed?
Experts say that when children are prevented from learning for a long period, their learning does not just stop, but it's also likely to regress. Look, we've now been saying for, as you said, nearly a year that this is a war on children, and what Palestinian children are living through is horrifying. Certainly, all children in Gaza are now in need of mental health and psychosocial support, and will suffer the trauma of this war throughout their lives. Children in Gaza do not live the typical lives of children. Every few years, they are forced to watch their family members, their neighbors, friends being killed, which causes anger and frustration in them. They often tend to be more aggressive, suffer from depression, anxiety, continuous traumatic stress disorder, and the lack of education certainly makes things worse. We know that prolonged periods without learning significantly jeopardizes children's futures. It disrupts their sense of stability. It contributes to their anxiety, to uncertainty in a society that was already facing a mental health crisis. And that was all compounded by several challenges, including the blockade, the impact of the blockade on their daily life. And education has many roles in a child's life. This includes a role for children living in conflict zones. In the first phase of an emergency, education can really protect children because it gives them a sense of stability, a chance to regain essential cognitive skills, but also life-saving learning, such as, for example, how to stay safe from unexploded bombs or how to prevent the spread of disease, which is sadly one of the emergencies right now in Gaza. And what's more, education is very important in Palestinian culture, whether there are job prospects or not. But now, with little food, children are malnourished. They have drones buzzing over their head 24 hours a day, and this is also affecting their sleep. And yet, our colleagues in Gaza are telling us that children often tell them that going back to school is their highest concern. And this is why we have set up learning spaces in Gaza with pre-existing shelters. And we are delivering life-saving lessons around unexploded ordnance, family separation, what to do during active shooting, disease prevention, but we're also distributing recreational kits, which include items like puzzles, stationery, coloring. And this is a way we hope that this will create a support system for them to cope with the severe psychosocial impact of the violence. Children react in very different ways to being exposed to war. It depends. They're not all the same, right? So they may sometimes introduce a traumatic element into playtime. Some of them may play games involving soldiers, for example, or violence. Some others may draw violent scenes. Some of them may display regression or violent behaviors. Some experience nightmares or bedwetting. Some others don't want to leave their mother's side. There's a whole range of behaviors. And in our centers, we try to use different approaches to try and tackle this, like expressive art, problem-solving games, simple breathing techniques. But it's a very long journey, and it's very challenging when forced displacement, bombs, and loss after loss continue to disrupt their sense of safety. Our colleagues are telling us that it's very hard. Our colleagues themselves have been displaced multiple times, so they're also struggling with their own mental health. This is an important work that we need to continue doing, but it's incredibly challenging. We're doing our best, but this alone will not be enough. And in Gaza, it's as if trauma has been passed down from one generation to the next, and they have no time for self-healing. It's almost a cycle that never ends.
Renda, the school building itself has become an object of trauma. I spoke to one Gazan mother who sought shelter for, I think, 2 weeks in one of the classrooms, and that place was the place where she felt fear and the place where everyone felt sick and where her husband was kidnapped, where her children didn't feel safe. So schools themselves, classrooms where children are supposed to be happy and learning and playing with their friends, have been converted into this object of something traumatic that they've been through. Can the education system ever actually go back to what it was? Can a school become a happy place for children again in Gaza, you think? What would it take for that to happen?
Well, there are many things that need to happen. Obviously, first of all, a ceasefire, a sense of security and stability. And as you rightly pointed out now, school buildings in Gaza are currently providing refuge in emergencies, but lack of alternative accommodation can cause a barrier to access to education even after the war ends. And even if hostilities ended tomorrow, this does not mean that children will be able to access the right to education right away. The widespread damage caused will require extensive work, starting with rubble removal. That will take several months. So rebuilding learning spaces and providing temporary housing are all key elements of, like getting children back to school. And finally, learning centers will need to be fit for purpose. Sadly, as of June, doctors in Gaza said that as many as 3,000 Palestinian children have lost their limbs in the war, a number that continues to rise every day. So it's a new generation of amputees who have a right to education, and there will be a need for adapted teaching, learning materials, assistive devices in great numbers to ensure that children with disabilities are allowed to return to school and resume their learning.
The Palestinian Ministry of Education, as we mentioned, has announced that the school year will begin on September 9. To what extent is this actually possible right now in Gaza, with so many schools destroyed, with violence still ongoing? And how likely is a situation where temporary learning spaces with remote learning actually going to be effective?
We have to do our best to make sure that these learning spaces are there, that we reach communities and let them know as well that this is a possibility. But realistically, the situation at the moment is catastrophic. There are repeated relocation orders, the so-called evacuation orders, right, from Israeli forces. These orders are forcibly displacing families multiple times and again and again and again. And this is one of the challenges. There isn't a base for families where they can get a routine, including sending their children regularly to learning spaces. Another challenge is safety, security. Just today, people were killed while queuing to get some bread outside of a UN school. So there is nowhere safe in Gaza. So as long as this continues, obviously there will be families who will be afraid of sending their children to informal schools because of the risks that the children would be taking by just walking to a different venue. And generally there is a lack of supplies. There's a lack of pretty much everything. There are still several obstructions to aid delivery. The crossings are still closed. The scale of the emergency is so huge that if violence doesn't stop, it will be very difficult to reach every children in need. Many children will be left out.
With so many fathers killed and families who have lost everything, their homes, their jobs, do you feel that more children are likely to be enrolled in the workforce instead of going back to school? Do you think that there's going to be an option for them to choose education rather than to potentially support their families?
That is sadly a reality in emergencies globally across the world. And we know from previous crises that the longer children are out of school, the greater the risk that they do not return. In the Gaza Strip, 40% of the population is 14 or under. We're talking about a huge segment of the population whose future is now at risk. This year, there were nearly 40,000 high school students who were unable to take their final exams, effectively halting their transition to higher education. Girls, for example, without safe schools throughout this year are facing additional risks, including gender-based violence and child marriage. There are older students with international scholarships who have lost those opportunities or been prevented from attending university abroad. So this war really is depriving another generation of Palestinians of their future. We know that unemployment rates in the Gaza Strip have now reached nearly 80% since the war started last October. So this is a shocking number. And as you pointed out, many of the Palestinians killed are men who were the only breadwinners in their family. So this means that even once the war is over, a huge number of families will be struggling financially. And it's very likely that there will be school dropouts. And obviously the risk of child labor is much higher than it was before.
What can be done immediately and in the long term to support Gaza students in a way that makes sure that they continue with their education in a safe environment, psychologically and physically?
Well, this is a very difficult question. As said, the first thing is an immediate, definitive ceasefire. The second thing is obviously for the whole aid community to continue supporting the Palestinian people. And to do that, there should not be aid obstruction challenges. So Israeli authorities have to ensure that unfettered humanitarian access is possible. They have an obligation, they have a responsibility. The crossings should be open. It's imperative for the government of Israel to fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law regarding access to education. The law is very clear. Schools are considered civilian objects and should be protected from attacks. In the future, once Gaza is not anymore a big breaking news story, is not anymore the main story in the news cycle, it's crucial that funding continues to be a priority to reconstruct Gaza. There have been other escalations of violence, but nothing of this scale. So there will be a need for funds directed specifically to education as one of the key drivers to build the resilience and the future of Palestinian children. And I'd like also this to be seen holistically as a very important priority, not just for the children of Gaza, but also for the children of the occupied West Bank. Education can certainly save lives. It's crucial. It provides a foundation for resilience. But, a ceasefire and also an end to the occupation are the only way to start rebuilding communities who have lost everything.
That's it on Beyond the Headlines for this week. Stay up to date on this story and everything else Gaza-related on thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi, Arthur Edison, and Rakan Abdulrahman. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and Dua Farid is our editor. And I'm your host, Nadal Tahir.